Hi there. In this video I'm going to be going over how to both cut off a project from the potter's wheel once you've got it made and it's set up a little bit, and then how to trim the bottom of it as well. You don't need nearly as much tools for this as you do for the actual throwing. Just a large and or small loop. Sometimes if you're doing something big you might need a large loop. Generally the small loop is really all you'd need. Metal rib, smooth metal rib will come in handy as well. And then to cut it off you're going to need your cutting wire. So once it's set up a little bit, this is actually set up overnight, partially covered, so it is not quite leather hard. It's a little bit before that. Leather hard is a little bit too much on the dry side, and it'd be okay for the trimming, but if I wanted to attach a handle to this in the case of a mug or something of the like, it's a little too dry for that. And then simply to get it off either the bat or the wheel head, depending on which one you're throwing it on, you want to take the wire and you want to lightly wrap around your fingers. Generally the handles are way too wide to just use them that way, so you just want to lightly wrap around your fingers. With the wire you got to be careful, it will dig in. If your project is really dry and you try to actually cut it, the wire digs in quite a bit and it can hurt and leave some marks for a little while. So don't pull too tightly. The important thing is you want to press down with your thumbs, because if you pull tight, the wire is going to come up off the wheel head or the bat slightly, and then you're going to end up removing more than you want from the bottom. So use your thumbs to press downward, and then just pull back toward yourself. Now you can see that came right off. Sometimes it takes a couple passes. It just really depends. Now once again, when you're handling any type of clay project, the top is going to be the weakest, so you want to handle it more from the bottom where it's going to be a lot stronger. I'm going to invert it, so flip it upside down like this, and I would let it dry here for a little bit longer. Once again, I could use the heat gun or a blow dryer or even a fan to dry this a little bit if I didn't want to wait. A lot of times if I'm doing multiples, I can go cut a bunch off, flip them over, and if I'm making handles, I can make the handles. By the time I come back, when I'm done with making the handles, the bottom's going to have been dry enough, and I can go ahead and work with from that point. Now in order to trim the bottom, you want it to be centered again, and there's a way to center it, not exactly like when we centered it when we were actually making it initially on the potter's wheel. The way that a lot of potters have learned, and that they still do, and it's very effective, it's called tap centering. They just get the wheel going, and then they hold two hands there, and they kind of watch one, and every time the clay gets close to that one, then they tap it away from that. Hence the name tap centering. And potters who've been doing it a long time, they can do it really fast and very effectively, and it works great. And then sometimes they just wet the clay down and they kind of tap it on there and it sticks while they're doing the trimming. Some potters, and the way that I learned actually, is then to use wads of clay to hold it down so it doesn't slide around on you. There's really no wrong way to do it. It's just kind of whatever you learned, whatever you're comfortable with, whatever is best for you. Now the problem I have with doing the tap centering is, in my classroom, there's just not time to actually teach it fully. By the time the students would get good at it, the class is essentially over for the semester, and we have other projects that we have to do. So with the amount of students that I have, and the amount of time we have, the amount of wheels, it's just not really efficient to expect them to know how to tap center. So because of that, I'm going to take the bat off here and set it aside. So because of that, I've got something known as the Giffin grip. So Giffin is the name of the company, and it's great. It's a centering tool essentially, not just for trimming things, but for decorating, doing lots of things. It's got a lot of purposes, and it just simply fits on top of the wheel hub like that, and it hooks on there, and then it's nice and centered just like the wheel is. And then it's got two halves, the top and the bottom. You turn the bottom half and it's going to move these little feet in, and that does a couple things. One, it helps you center it because it scooches it toward the center, and then the other thing is it holds it in place so you don't need any of the wads of clay. So in terms of using it in the classroom with students who just don't have the time to learn tap centering, it is a great tool. It's well worth it. I bought one for my classroom several years ago, and I'm very glad that I did, because that way I can actually show them how to trim the bottom, even with the constraints on time that we have. So the way to use this is you set the clay kind of toward the center, you just eyeball it, and then you turn the top half, and then you want to scoot the clay kind of as you go. What you don't want to do is just kind of lazily set it onto the side and then crank and hope it's going to center it, because it's not going to work. The clay is so soft, those little feet are going to just cave it in, dent it, and just kind of squish it out of shape. And then not only is it not centered, but then it is also damaged and probably just likely going to have to restart instead of taking the time to fix it. So scoot it by hand, kind of eyeball it, make sure all the feet are on there, and then give it a little test to make sure it's not going to move at all, so there shouldn't be any sideways motion with it whatsoever, and then it is now essentially perfectly centered. The only downside to using this is, especially with students that are beginning, if their top, so this is upside down now, so if the top that's actually touching the bottom of the Giffin grip there, if that would not be centered, then the bottom's not centered either, so it wouldn't work, because then none of it's going to be centered since it's based on the top being centered. It doesn't come up a lot, but it has from time to time, so that would be the downside to that. If the student doesn't make the project correctly in the first place, then obviously it's not going to work, but in most cases it does work really, really well. So I'm going to get the wheel going slow. Unlike when you're working on the potter's wheel doing your centering and everything, where you have to be going fairly fast, you can actually tell if it's centered. We know this is centered because either you tap centered, or in this case you use the Giffin grip. So we don't need to have it going very fast. Just a speed like that works pretty well. If you have it going really fast, it's tougher to see what you're doing. Plus, all the little trimmings that come off, they go flying everywhere. It's a bigger mess to clean up. So right there looks pretty good. So I'm going to take the small loop, and I always recommend using the flat side as opposed to the rounded side. The rounded side just digs in way too much, and it's just too easy to go through. Whereas the flat side, especially if you go to a really shallow angle, it'll only take just thin layers off, which is much more preferable. And when I mean shallow, I mean holding it very, very almost parallel to the pot itself. Because if you come in here like this, it's going to grab and you're going to remove big chunks and you get all types of issues. So if you come in really at a slow or a shallow angle like this, then it's going to remove very little. And it's always okay, because you can always come back and remove more. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to trim the profile, which is this outer edge. And the reason I'm going to do that, well, I'll talk more about that in a second, but I want to do this first. That's where it tends to be the thickest, because that's where the bottom meets the wall, and that's really tough to pull the clay up from there when we're doing the initial throwing. So I recommend doing that part first. Two hands, using two hands to be stable, just like when we were doing the initial throwing, is always a great idea. You don't just want to come in here with one hand and just hold the tool, because it's going to get moved around and everything will be uneven. So I always take my non-dominant hand, I'm left-handed, so that'd be my right, and I rest it on the top, and then my thumb is just kind of hanging out here on the side, and then I rest the actual loop tool on the thumb. Like that. As you can see, the clay's coming off in strips like this. That's exactly what you want. It should even be soft enough that you can kind of squish it back together. It's a really good stage for doing this. If the clay came off and it was it cracked a little bit, not ideal, but okay. If it comes off in like smaller chunks, it's getting a little bit too dry. That's close to leather hard. If it comes off as powder, it's way too dry. It's bone dry, and you don't want to trim like that. It's a lot tougher to do. Plus, you don't want to be getting all that dust into the air. So if a project would ever dry that much, you would need to wet it back down to get to the point that it's a lot softer for the trimming. So as you can see, I'm removing some of this. And I always like to put a little undercut on mine, so when it's sitting on the surface, you actually have the spot that kind of goes under it a little bit. I just like the way it looks. It's not something that's required for all pots. I just think it kind of gives them a nice floating effect, especially since a lot of times I will do the foot ring with a black underglaze, so it kind of adds that effect as well. Now, what is the purpose of doing this foot ring? There's a couple different reasons. One is that you're removing some of the extra clay. That way the weights overall is the same. That way the walls are the same thickness. This part down toward the bottom is the same thickness, and the bottom itself is the same thickness. So it kind of helps, especially for beginning where things tend to be a little bit thicker. So evening that out, that's one reason. Aesthetically, I just like the looks of them. The foot ring, because I sign on the bottom on the inside, it's kind of a nice little frame for this signature, and I usually glaze on the inside of the foot ring as well. So I just kind of like it for personal aesthetic reasons. And a big reason, though, is kind of a functional thing. If this was a mug or a bowl or a cup and we're putting hot or cold liquids in here, and the foot ring is going to keep the bottom raised up so it's not transferring that heat onto the surface, especially wooden surfaces, because those can the heat and the cold can damage wooden surfaces if you're not careful. So those are the main reasons to do the foot ring. I think it's just a nice skill to know. So I don't have to just remove clay from the bottom, I can also shape it a little bit. So for instance, let's say I want this to be a little bit more rounded, I can actually go in and do that just by following the contour of the edge. Okay, so once I've got the profile done pretty well, now I'm going to do the middle. Once again, I'm going to use the flat side, use 2 hands for support. I'm going to start in the middle and just pull my way to the outside. Try to pull as straight back toward yourself as you can. Now here's the issue that people run into. How deep do you go, and how do you know how deep you can go? There's a couple ways to do that. I think the quickest, easiest is just by sound. You tap on the bottom, you'll hear that. It's kind of like a drum basically, because if you think about it, it's just this thin membrane over top and then it's hollow on the inside. If you tap on that, the higher the pitch is, the thinner the clay is. So if it's kind of more of a thud, you probably got a little bit of clay you can still work with. If it gets to be a higher pitch, it's getting definitely thin enough. Also, if it gets really thin, it's going to flex a lot more when you push on it. Some potters will actually go through until they can actually flex a little bit. I don't like to go quite that far. But one thing you can't do is when we were doing the throwing in the previous video, and we took the needle tool and we jabbed the bottom, and then we could check the thickness of the bottom that way. That doesn't work now because the clay's not soft enough. We're not going over it again. We're not able to compress the bottom to get rid of any holes that we were making in there. So you don't want to do that. Luckily though, since we did check the thickness in the previous video, I kind of already have an idea of how thick I made the bottom, so I kind of know how far I can go. It's not going to be exact, but it gives me a rough idea. Now I can go a little bit deeper here on the sides, because that's actually where the wall starts to curve upward on the inside. So it would be a lot tougher for me to go too far through on that point. The middle is where you really have to watch out, because that's where it was the thinnest. How thick do you leave this ring? It kind of depends. I like to make them about as thick as the walls are on whatever item I happen to be making. So my walls were probably about that thick. So that's about how thick I'm going to make the foot ring. That way it's kind of consistent all the way through. That sounds like a pretty good thickness right there. Now when it came to doing the profile first, as I mentioned, the reason I wanted to do that first was because then that tells me how much clay I have left to work with. If I would do the foot ring in the middle first, come out to here, and then still have this left to go, then when I come back and remove some of that excess clay, I don't know, I could end up removing too much. So that's why you always want to do the profile first, so you can realize how much clay you actually have left to deal with to do the foot ring. And I like to go in and round it a little bit so it doesn't hurt any surfaces. And if you leave really sharp edges, you go to scoot it across a wooden table or something like that, you could actually scratch it if the surface is too rough. Alright, that's looking pretty good. Alright, so metal rib, as I mentioned, kind of use that on there. Just going to dab a little bit of water on there, on the metal rib, so it just slides along faster, or easier rather. And I'm just going to go back and forth from the middle to the outside, vice versa. And this is going to kind of compress the bottom like we did with the wood rib on the inside on the previous video with the throwing. This kind of flattens everything out. That way things are even and they're not going to dry at different rates and then possibly cause cracks. And I can also use this to make sure the foot ring itself is level. going to round everything out. Then lastly, I'm going to take just a normal sponge, some water on there to get a final bit of smoothing. Some people really like the look of the spiral in the bottom when you go to trim it. Students are always amazed that they think that's awesome, that when you trim it kind of leaves a little bit of a spiral behind. They like the look of that. That is something you can actually add back in. As I believe I mentioned in the previous video, people like that look because then it looks more authentic and handmade. So a lot of potters will add the throwing marks back in there after they've got everything even. They'll go back either with their tools or their fingers and actually purposely add some deep marks in there, just for the aesthetic look of it. And sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't, it just kind of depends. Alright, and there we go. So one thing you do have to be careful if that's a little wet, and your hands can leave fingerprints if you're not careful, so pick it up maybe about halfway or so. So that's got a pretty good weight to it now, since I did remove some of that excess. So it's pretty well balanced. And if I was turning this into a mug, now would be the stage that I would attach a handle to it. Otherwise, it's just kind of a short, shallow bowl, or even a cup. It kind of depends on what your definition of everything is. It's pretty open interpretation. I could etch some design in this if I wanted to, and then I would sign the bottom. I personally like to use a kind of a dull pencil to sign the bottom as opposed to a needle tool, which is a little bit too harsh of a line in my opinion. So I sign it with just a dull, normal wooden pencil, and then I wipe the little burrs off after it's dried a little bit. Some people sign on the foot ring, some people sign kind of toward the edge. I usually go toward the middle. In Japan, since the pottery is a very, very big deal over there, they actually sign on the outside. That way you don't even have to pick the item up to see who made it, and then they kind of have a stamp and everything that goes with that. So it's all personal preference, no really wrong way to sign it. But definitely always want to sign your work, that way you know who made it. You don't have to date it. Some people do, some don't. Once again, it's kind of a personal preference. I usually don't, unless it's kind of a one-of-a-kind item or a gift or something like that, then I might do that. But those are the basics of throwing. So trimming rather. Went over throwing in the last video, trimming here, so now we have a finished product. So thanks for watching.